All right, everyone. So I want to explain the final major topic or major subject area that will be assessed in tomorrow's unit exam, which is gerrymandering. And gerrymandering really doesn't fit as part of the linkage institutions unit. I do this in this particular place every year just because there isn't another home for it. And so it is kind of a standalone, but there are questions on the test. So make sure you're doing whatever you need to be doing during the lecture to kind of commit some of this to more longer term memory. I think if you follow with it, it is pretty intuitive and definitely kind of like, oh, I get it now kind of thing. And so I want to kind of go through, explain what it is before you read an article on it and answer a couple questions. So you will come back to this graphic. I think this graphic is actually a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful way to understand gerrymandering. And maybe we'll return to it towards at the end. It is in the packet as well. So first question, obviously, is what is it? What is gerrymandering? And the story of gerrymandering cannot be understood or cannot be told if we don't first kind of explain how U.S. congressional districts are drawn and why they are redrawn, right? We know already at this point that the United States is constitutionally required to run a census, to take a full census of its citizenry every 10 years, right? And so every 10 years, the government hires a bunch of people to go out there and figure out who is living where, how old are they, what are their education levels, what are their income levels, what do they need in order to make government decisions and allocate resources. And after the census is finished, about 2 years usually afterwards, because it takes 2 years to kind of crunch the data and figure it all out, 2 years after the census, state legislators, and that's a really critical part because it's state legislators that do redistricting, state legislators get together to redraw their state's federal congressional boundaries, right? And so if we were to take Colorado, 7 congressional districts. And so the map of Colorado, a very clean square, is going to be divided into 7 sections with an elected representative from each of those districts reporting to the U.S. House of Representatives to represent Colorado and their constituents in Congress. And so the boundaries of these congressional districts are what we are talking about. 2 years after the census, state legislators get together to talk redrawing them. And gerrymandering is what has historically happened in this process. What started out as like probably a pretty innocent, like, hey, state legislators need to get together to draw the boundaries, was quickly realized that state legislators could artificially manipulate the boundaries of these districts in order to favor one party or a class, right? And so, for example, well, we're going to look at all the different ways you can gerrymander on the next slide. But if I am, let's say the Democrats are in charge of the Colorado State Legislature, there is a way that they could strategically draw the 7 boundaries to allow them to control probably 6 out of the 7 of them, right? And they could severely disfavor Republicans. And so this process of artificially manipulating the boundaries is called gerrymander, right? And what has happened over the last 100 years is that the district shapes that have resulted as parties try to do this have really become like truly absurd and really are a threat to people's ability to find their democratic voice and find representation. To give you an example, here is Maryland's 3rd congressional district. In the 83rd Congress, which would have been about 100 years ago, you can see in the top left the shape of what the 3rd district was. 88th, it stayed the same. 93rd, it's starting to grow. But then you get all the way down here to the 113th Congress, and this is Maryland's 3rd congressional district. It doesn't make any sense, right? Like, why is this big piece up here connected to this one by this little itty bitty corridor that may not be more than like 2 streets wide? And so you might live if you live in this one little red strip, you have one congressional representation, but your neighbor behind you has somebody completely different. And it is a total absurdity. Here's another one. Here's Pennsylvania's 7th district from the 83rd Congress to the 113th. And it is drawn this way with all these little like peninsulas and stickouts and weird little shapes. It's drawn this way to favor a particular party or a particular group. And so you can see, like, a more sensible way of drawing this would be to just basically take Pennsylvania and divide it into a bunch of reasonably equal squares, right? Or square-like shapes. So why do politicians gerrymander? And the answer obviously is for political advantage, right? If you can draw boundaries in such a way that strengthen Republicans or weaken Democrats or vice versa, then your party gets greater representation in Congress, and you can control the House of Representatives, get the Speaker of the House seat, and boom, suddenly you are controlling one of the big avenues of power in this country. Now, the two ways that you can gerrymander is to essentially put as many members of one group into one district to limit their impact on neighboring districts. So let's take, for example, this map of North Carolina below. North Carolina is heavily majority African American in certain parts of the state, right? Like in the urban areas of North Carolina, there is a strong African American majority, right? In Winston-Salem, in Durham, in Chapel Hill, in Raleigh, in Charlotte, all of these cities are strongly majority African American. And African Americans, we've already talked about, are some of the most reliably Democratic voters in the country. And so if you were to evenly divide the African American population into all, 13 of North Carolina's congressional districts, then you could potentially cause many of those districts to swing blue, right? Because, if you put 100,000 African Americans in Charlotte into the 9th congressional district, the 9th might flip blue. So rather than kind of fracturing them and putting them and diffusing their influence all over, what if you just create boundaries that basically pack all the majority African American areas into one district? Basically saying, well, we'll give you the 12th, the 4th, and the 1st in order to make sure that you have no influence in the other 9 districts. And the numbers I'm using are related to the number you see on the map. So that's called packing. You put as many members of one party into one district and say that one's yours, but you will not influence any of the others. And you can do it racially. You can do it income level. We know that, historically middle-class voters tended to go Democratic, so let's make sure all the middle-class voters are packed into one district, right? So you could do it that way. The other way is cracking them, packing and cracking. So cracking would be taking those populations and basically splitting them up. She's like splitting them up and basically diminishing their influence and basically saying, well, if we split them up into these 13 districts, then they're never more than 10% of the district's population. And therefore, they won't really tip anything. And then we can just control all of them. And what's interesting about this is North Carolina, take a look at the map, has been so heavily gerrymandered that North Carolina actually has more registered Democrats in that state than Republicans and has been skewing blue for quite a while. And yet, as of 2014, Republicans controlled 10 out of the 13 congressional districts because Republicans have managed to gerrymander that district so much that they've managed to limit the influence of those Democratic voting blocs. This is the most extreme example of this election district. This is the 12th congressional district in North Carolina. As I already said, African Americans have large majority populations in North Carolina's cities. Charlotte, Winston-Salem, High Point, Greensboro, and Durham are majority African American cities. And so the Republicans found a way to draw the boundary so that they could link all of these cities into one district, which, Democrats carry and win 100 times out of 100 because it's so jam-packed with traditional Democratic voting blocks that basically Republicans don't have a chance to win. But then at the same token, the Winston-Salem Democratic bloc and the Durham Democratic bloc and the Charlotte Democratic bloc are not like influencing or muddying the waters in the other districts. And so, just a check for understanding question, is this an example of packing or cracking? If you said packing, you are right? They packed together all these voters into one district, basically said, this one's yours, now stay out all the rest. Okay, and so moving on here, you can see if Democrats controlled the North Carolina State House, because remember, it's state legislators that draw the boundaries. So let's say Democrats got control of the North Carolina State House, and then they gerrymandered North Carolina. You could see how they could take the same population totals and gerrymander it in such a way that they would now control 9 of the 13 districts. Which is pretty much the exact mirror opposite of what currently exists. Republicans control 10, Democrats control 3. Well, you can see now the map has been gerrymandered, so Democrats control 9 and Republicans control 4. And so if gerrymandering is to happen, and this really gets at kind of where the AP exam might assess, if gerrymandering is going to happen, a couple things need to be in place. As I said, we need, in order to gerrymander, we need complete control of the state legislature and the governor's office. So there needs to be unified government at the state level. Remember, unified government is the opposite of divided government. Divided government at the federal level is like, let's say the president is Democrat, but Congress is Republican, or the president is Republican and the Senate is Republican, but the House is Democrat. That's divided government. Unified government is when one party controls all levels of that, either the federal or the state. So at the state level, unified government looks like one, let's say, Democratic governor with a Democratic state Senate and a Democratic House. If there is unified government at the state level, then the single party that is in control of both the state Congress and the governorship can basically draw the map, redistrict it in such a way as to give themselves an advantage. That's gerrymandering. So how does gerrymandering impact American citizens? And there's been a lot of Supreme Court challenges to it recently because, the argument has been is that under a gerrymandered district, you are diminishing the value of people's votes, right? There's something in the Constitution called the Equal Protection Clause, right, which basically says that every citizen in America is afforded the same due process and equal protection under the law, and that their voice and their vote matters just the same as everyone else. But if you gerrymander a district, the argument has been is that in heavily gerrymandered districts, people's voices actually don't count the same as other people's. Now, what it does, impact-wise, a lot of studies have confirmed this, that it strongly weakens political efficacy because it gives people this belief that their vote doesn't matter. I am in such an overwhelmingly Republican district that why do I even bother voting, right? It's not going to make a difference, or vice versa. Another thing that gerrymander does is increase incumbency advantage, right? Because if your district has been gerrymandered to your advantage, then you're probably going to win 100 times out of 100. And then last, we get to kind of what we're seeing in the storming of the Capitol and the state of the country today, which is political polarization, which is the two parties. It's like we're living in a two-state America where Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and liberals are so divided that there's no common ground. And the problem with gerrymandering is it makes this worse because if you gerrymander districts to where they're super safe for one party or the other, and they're not like a battleground district, then you get these congressional representatives that can effectively do or say whatever they want. Because what are you going to do? Vote for a Democrat? Right? Or what are you going to do? Vote for a Republican? And they go like, no, the Democrat will never win this district. So you can get whatever, crazy person in this district to say whatever they want because they know they're not going to lose. A great example of this is Steve King in Iowa. Steve King in Iowa was a card-carrying racist, literally was a former member of the KKK. The guy said horribly racist stuff all the time, yet he hung around in Congress for a long time because the district was so gerrymandered they were never going to vote for a Democrat.